Well, I don't know what Hal was saying about my truck and about my house, but I guess beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? I appreciate that, Hal, and I enjoy the song selection before the sermon and the message. So we have these idioms or phrases that we like to often say in our culture that sometimes we don't know the meaning of very well. Maybe riding shotgun, for example, riding in the front seat of the car. Now, maybe I'm guessing most of you know this was from when they were riding the stagecoaches and they were getting robbed. The guy riding up front had a shotgun, which made me question always his choice of weapon, because would you want something that required them to be that close that might also hit your horses? I think a different selection of a weapon might have been a better choice, but I digress on that. Maybe you have heard of showing your true colors, which is meant to confuse enemy warships. They would raise different flags, but the law was when you got really close, you had to show your true colors before you could fire, which is showing how authentic or genuine one might be, or one we're all probably familiar with. You've tucked your kids in before. Sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite. They think the sleeping tight comes from Shakespearean's age, when they used to actually, with ropes, tighten the mattresses. So to sleep tight was to be comfortable. So today we're going to look at another common phrase we use often in our culture today, but sometimes I wonder if we know the true meaning of it. The phrase comes from the book of Daniel. See, we're towards the end of our series in the book of Daniel. Only 2 weeks left as we sprint to the finish. And if you were to Google this phrase called the writing on the wall, the Google machine would tell you to describe it as hard times, or the outcome is determined, or destruction is on the way. And these might be partially true. But I think what we'll see today as we go through this story is, in fact, it is so much bigger than those meanings. So before we get into this today, I have to tell you about something cool that's been going on during the sermons, that's going on right now. A few months ago, Marna came to me and she's like, I would really like to teach the kids during the sermon time. I know we've been doing the babysitting, the rotating, and that's great, but could I teach them? And so we worked with the elders. We put a plan together. Marna's been working hard every Sunday. If you haven't noticed, she listens to my sermons every Monday morning and gives me a review text back, which I appreciate. And so we came home last Sunday from church. Hopefully the audio works on this, and this is what Silas did last Sunday.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Acts, the letter of the Romans. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians and Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus and Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd 3rd John, Jude and Revelation.
So I'm so thankful for this as a parent. I'm so thankful for the great work Marna's doing with our kids. I'm told Andrew and Xavier are very close, if not there, with the singing. Are they singing at home as well?
As soon as we get back in the car.
Oh my goodness, we have been singing this and the Old Testament. He doesn't quite have the Old Testament down. Oddly enough, he keeps forgetting Daniel. Like, yeah, thanks, son. But we're working on that one. I'm just so thankful for all the work so many in this church are doing to instill faith in the next generation, our children. So let's thank God for that as we get started. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the work of this church. So many, the faithful work they're doing to pass on faith to our kids. We know that it's always one generation away from not hearing your message, not hearing your story, not learning about your goodness. So we ask that you bless their efforts, that our kids may see your kingdom, that it would expand and grow in their hearts, that they may live lives that follow and serve and honor you. God, today as we open up our Bibles, help us to see the ways in which we need to live our faith boldly. May we learn from these generations before us as we read this story, but as we read it, more importantly, may we see the story of you. The story of you over and over again, working in the world even when it might seem like you aren't. And for people being faithful even when everything was up at a loss for them. So pour through me the gift of preaching, that this deep faith may grow in our hearts. It's in your name that I pray. Amen. So between chapter 4 of Daniel and between chapter 5 of Daniel, a lot happens in that time. Okay? King Nebuchadnezzar is the focus of so much of the book of Daniel, and suddenly he's gone. Now, what's really cool is Babylon took really good records, historical records of what happened. So we're able to piece together pretty well what happened between chapter 4 and what happened between chapter 5. So King Nebuchadnezzar has died. And if you remember from earlier in chapter 2, his dream of this statue. And he was excited because his kingdom was the head, the golden statue. But next was to become the Persian Mede Empire, which were the chests and the arms made of silver. Well, we find ourselves here at this transition point between the golden head and the silver body. So King Nebuchadnezzar, after dying from old age, his son, as you would expect, took over his kingdom. Now, apparently things didn't go too well in the family because his son only reigned for 2 years before his brother-in-law murdered him in 560 BC. His brother-in-law held the throne for 4 years until a puppet ruler came in, ruled for a couple months, and then finally came this guy named Nabonidus, and he became king from 556 BC to 539 BC. Now, Nabonidus married the granddaughter of King Nebuchadnezzar. However, Nebuchadnezzar, he had some worship political issues. See, he really liked to worship the god of the sky called Sin. And in Babylon, they were really into worshiping Marduk. So how do you do this? Well, he kind of lived in exile. He went into an oasis in what is now Saudi Arabia. He's living there, and his son is king, King Belshazzar. He's king while everything is going on, but he's kind of like dad's doing things in the background. Son's a little younger, a little brash. He's the king of the city, and dad's kind of taking care of things maybe in his brashness. Now, when kings change, maybe like when we're used to presidents change, the officials that work behind them change as well. So there is a lot of change going on through all these different kings coming through in just a few years. And Daniel kind of gets caught up in that. He maybe has a minor role in the kingdom, if anything at all. He's well into retirement years at this point and probably isn't doing much. I think he probably thinks, okay, my time in the spotlight, my time ruling, my time with God working through me in these wonders and miracles, those have passed, and I'm just going to live out my last days faithfully. You still with me on this history stuff here? Okay, so I need to take you to a special October day. Maybe not as special as the October days we've been having, because they've been pretty good this past week. But this was October 12th, 539 BC. It's the night of a national feast in Babylon. They were having a celebration that they had probably been planning, anticipating, looking forward to for a very long time. However, there were problems outside of the city walls. The Persians and the Medes had surrounded the city. But if you remember from last week, this shouldn't be a cause for much of an alarm. They have 2 double walls going over there, some spanning as 300 feet high, chariots on top, moats coming with the Euphrates River. All the intel is everything's good. It is impossible for someone to come in here and attack us. Everything will be fine. Continue the party as anticipated. And so that is what we did. That is what they did as we turn into our Bibles and we read about this party in Daniel chapter 5. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem so that the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that he had taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, of wood, and stone. Now, this is quite the party they're having. This party is the kind of party that would make Las Vegas blush, okay? And they bring in this time, they're like, hey, what can we do? Well, let's bring out those old gold goblets and things to drink from. That sounds fun, right? Now, this is more than just getting out grandma's fine china, okay? There's more going on here. Remember to take the symbols and the artifacts from inside God's temple is to say that God had no power. That God could not defend itself. It could not do anything with it. And so remember, this question loomed for a long time. Today in Bible class, the kids learned about when the Ark of the Covenant was taken from the Philistines. And the Philistines got this plague because of it. And their God was destroyed because of it, their idol. And they actually take it back. They're like, we don't want it. And so for, maybe 70 years now, these captive Israelites in slavery are like, well, what about these artifacts? Where is God? Is God going to do anything with them? And so they're taking these goblets that were once used by the priests, and they are getting intoxicated with them. They are praising the god Marduk with these goblets. And on the surface, it seems here like the god of Babylon is winning. Like Marduk has taken the stage and won the day. And so the question is, what will the God of Israel do about it? Will he just allow this? I think Belshazzar and his concubines and his wives have no thought, no worry in the world. It had been decades since they'd been conquered. Nothing was going to happen. That was until we continue on. Suddenly, the finger of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. Okay, what a terrifying sight. I mean, the handwriting is on the wall where the king can see it under the lampstand where it's clearly legible by everyone. And I imagine the guests screaming and yelling, terrified. The wives, the concubines reacting the same way. But the story wants us to see, most of all, the writer wants us to focus in on the king, King Belshazzar. How is he going to react to this? He becomes pale. He's terrified. He's knock-kneed. He looks like me giving blood. Last time I gave blood, I said, hey, I pass out, just to let you know. They said, we're not worried about it. I woke up with them slapping me in the face, right? That's how it goes. So some of you medical people are going to get to enjoy that one day. Just preparing you. So what does the king do? What all kings do. He summons in all of his officials. Okay, here's the writing on the wall, guys. What does this writing on the wall mean? Let's take a look at it. Let's try to decipher it. Now, many years have gone by. Belshazzar doesn't think anything of this playbook. These officials are probably new officials. They're like, oh, yeah, we'll figure this out. They have no clue what they are going to do. And so it's in fact said in the text that it becomes more alarming to the king, that he becomes even more pale, even more knock-kneed and shaking. And so his mommy comes. His mommy comes to save the day. Here she is in verse 10 as we pick up there. The queen, hearing the voice of the king and his noblemen, came into the banquet hall. May the king live forever, she said. Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intellect and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he'll tell you what the writing means. Now, I think as a girl, King Belshazzar's mother witnessed or had heard rumors about the interpreting that Daniel did for her father or grandfather. She probably had seen him at banquets, witnessed him ruling and leading throughout the country. And she at just the right time is like, I know the guy. Hey, son, don't pass out on me. Be the king, be a leader, calm down. Just go get this guy. And she's like, we can get the help. We can fix this. Now, I want to clarify something. It keeps calling him his father. And if you look in the first few verses at the footnotes, you'll see it's actually described as ancestor or predecessor. A more literal translation might be forefather. Okay, King Nebuchadnezzar is not his actual father. So I wonder here, where's Daniel? I think Daniel's asleep. I think they're up at night partying and Daniel's just, he's just having a good night's rest. Could you imagine being the official sent to wake him up? Daniel, we need you. And he's stumbling around, coming to. I imagine he's got his robe and his house slippers on as he goes before the king. And I imagine he's going, are we going to do this again? Oh, really? Here we go again. Got to go help another king. Got to bail them out. Got to work on this situation with them before the king. And so he's brought before the king. And the king does the normal thing we've seen every week. Now, if you can interpret this dream, I'm going to give you a gold necklace. I'm going to give you a purple robe. You're going to be third in command of the kingdom. It's going to be great if you could just do this for me. Daniel's like, I've seen all this before. Is what I think he's thinking. So Daniel instead of just interpreting the dream, has something else in mind. Because in fact, he did get woken up in the middle of his sleep. He's got a lecture in mind. Then Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all nations and all peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted, and those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from his people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. This is what we learned last week. Now here's where the finger starts getting pointed. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You have the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praise the gods of gold, of bronze, of iron, of wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hands your life and all your ways. That is what he has to say to him. He let him have it, right? He didn't mince any words talking to the king. And I love how he starts off. Keep your status symbols. I don't need those, okay? Don't worry about that with me. And instead he tells the king a thing or two, because the king has forgotten, or maybe more accurately said, has chosen not to follow the history of his own country and who's really in charge. So Daniel's like, sit down, son. Sit down, son. Let me teach you a history lesson about how your grandfather acted like a cow out there in the pastures, right? He's like, hey, your grandpa was rolling around with the donkeys. Now, this is meant to be humorous when he talks about the donkeys, okay? Because we all know the other names for donkeys. And he's like, hey, yeah, great grandpa, he was acting like a donkey. That's how he lost his mind. That's how much God humbled him. And so the message is, King Belshazzar, you should have humbled yourself as well. But instead, here comes the interpretation. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting or found guilty. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar's command, Daniel, was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in all the kingdom. And Daniel was just trying to sleep that night. So he gets all the clothes he didn't want. He probably just wants to go back to bed. It's kind of ironic because this dream, or this writing on the wall, it's bad news. It is very bad news. His reign is numbered. He's been found guilty. His kingdom is divided. And the king's got a lot to sleep on. That would be the normal way to go with Nebuchadnezzar here, to sleep on this, to consider, to think about it, but no. No, instead, here comes the punchline. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. The king was secure in his kingdom, in his walls, in his authority, in his army. And little did he know what the enemy had up its sleeve. See, the Persians and the Medes did something that was thought to be impossible at the time. They diverted the Euphrates River, where the water could build up somewhere else in kind of a reservoir, and they waited till just the right time when the king and all his officials were partying and drunk, and the diverted water gave gaps in the moat where the Medes and the Persians could come underneath and launch a surprise attack on the city. They conquered the city, and one of the generals of this army, Darius, took over as king of the city. So what does the writing on the wall mean? It certainly means hard times are coming, that the outcome is set, that destruction is on the way. But more than that, the writing on the wall is a reminder of who's really in charge of the world. Who's really running the show? Who really has the ultimate power and authority? The writing on the wall begs us to answer the question, which way are you going to live? Are you going to live like King Belshazzar? Or are you going to live like Daniel? Which choice are you going to make? Could you imagine how Daniel must have felt after King Nebuchadnezzar's death? He witnessed the country he served fall apart multiple times. I imagine him saying to himself and his buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, many times, like, when are these kings going to learn from history? Do they not know what's going on? Do they not know what's going to happen? I imagine him rehearsing the lecture he gave in his head a few times before he let the king have it in the middle of the night, right? The writing on the wall serves like a traffic sign. A traffic sign that says, hey, warning, there is danger ahead. You better be careful of the things to come. Because Belshazzar was living a prideful, indulgent, selfish life. And you know what? For years it seemed fine. And we encounter people like that in the world, don't we? That for years they live this way, and you're like, when is it ever going to catch up with them? I don't know. It doesn't seem to ever catch up with them. And it wasn't until the very end that he saw a problem with the way he was living. God gave Belshazzar way too much of the same thing God gives you and I, free will. See, we all have free will in this life. We have free will to choose which God or gods we're going to serve. But make no mistake, we all serve one God or another. So that's our question. How are we going to serve? Which God are we going to commit our life to? In verse 22, Daniel tells the king, you knew this history, buddy. You knew this, and you chose to do nothing with it. Because there's a difference of knowing the past, knowing what we ought to do, right? And actually doing it. Actually making a commitment to learn from the past, to learn from others' mistakes, to follow Jesus, to humble ourselves before God. And sometimes, I think we listen to sermons like they're an intellectual exercise, right? Like the goal of the sermon is somehow to keep you entertained, to keep you awake for a little bit. Maybe I'm not as good at that part of it. To stimulate your mind intellectually somehow, but that's not the goal. The goal of the sermon is to implore us to live out the text we have been given that week, to call us to change our lives with accordance of what Scripture has told us to do that week. So in verse 23, Daniel tells the king, you knew this information, but you set yourself up. You set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. That's a place I don't want to be in life. Set up against the Lord of heaven. The decision eventually caught up with Belshazzar, as we've seen. And you know what? It eventually catches up with all of us. So who are we to idolize? Once again, it's Daniel. We're to be like Daniel. Daniel's faith is unwavering. He's going to keep his commitments to God regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the consequences. He is going to live this committed faith. You know what? Daniel has such great faith that Daniel doesn't even try to control God. When all these issues were popping up in the country he served, when all these things were falling apart, Daniel just waits patiently. What are our prayers tempted to sound like? What we might be tempted to say to God, like, God, do you see what's going on in the world here? Can you take some action? Are you seeing this? Where are you working? Are you going to allow this to continue, God? Is what our desperate prayers sound like sometimes. And then if that doesn't work, what do we like to do? We like to roll up our sleeves and take it upon ourselves and say, we're going to do some work here. Yet Daniel has a faith that, God's going to fix this. And things might seem rough and things might be dark, but God's going to bring everything about. And when God works, everything will be perfect. The timing will be perfect. God will bring true justice, and he will use us how we are needed to be used as God's humble servant. Daniel had great faith. So I can't help but wonder if King Belshazzar is who Jesus had in mind when Jesus talked about the rich young fool. Belshazzar had the most modern defense systems. He had 20 years of food stored up. He had fine clothes and wine, and he had enemies at the gates. And even then, it seemed time to eat and drink and be married. And the writing on the wall sounds a lot like Luke 12:20, which says this. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then you will get what you have prepared. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? So Belshazzar failed to recognize who really was in charge of the world. And as a result of that, he lost his kingdom. He lost his very life because of it. But make no mistake, we have a choice. We can humble ourselves before God. We can choose who we want to serve. We can make the commitment, if we haven't already, as we're going to witness here in a few minutes, of someone making the decision to take on Jesus in baptism and to follow him with their life. So may we not make the same mistake today.